Okay, welcome to episode 10 of the SumerSports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm one of your hosts. I'm the VP of Research and Development at SumerSports. I'm joined not only by Thomas Dimitroff, the CEO of SumerSports, the former general manager of the Atlanta Falcons, but also Jack Easterby, who vice president of player. Jack, give us your former title at Houston because you have many of them.
I was the executive vice president of football operations. Thanks for having me, brother.
Excellent. Well, we love having you.
Say this was a boon for us already. Yeah. Traveling through Atlanta and joining us, we had some business to talk about. Dear friend of mine, massive respect for Jack. So I'm just happy you're able to join us. This is going to be.
And I think it's going to be so great because obviously, Thomas and I we haven't had guests yet. We had planned eventually to have one, but obviously you coming through town. And being able to join us, for episode 10 of our new show is so great. Frazier in the comments, thank you for being here. Everybody, we really appreciate you guys coming in and joining us here. I think, Thomas, as we were planning for this has become kind of an interesting week, right? Because we have an NFL team that is in the thick of a playoff race right now at 7-5, and the Tennessee Titans have decided to make a change of general manager, and I think it caught us all by surprise, huh?
Look, I've talked to a number of my contemporaries around the league. I think I still call them my contemporaries, don't I?
Yes.
Just speaking with everyone, generally speaking, the general managers in the league, they're on edge over it. When there are firings in the quarter part of the season or beyond, it's really unsettling for general managers. Normally, general managers feel they get through a season, they sit down with their owners, they discuss what needs to be fixed, and if it can't be fixed and you can't come to an agreement, well, then you readdress where you are, right? That it was rare in the past that there were GMs getting fired during the season. Look, I experienced it. Hands up. This is what really had me perplexed. John Robinson, by the way, a very good football man and really adept at so many levels. He was 7-5, heading into potentially another playoff. Might even win the division, right?
Yes, I think he's got the division.
He's got the division.
Handle it.
Yeah. And the fact that he gets fired during this time versus, I look back when I got fired 2.5 years ago, as much as I disagreed with Arthur on it, I still understood that we weren't doing well and our record was nowhere near what J-Rob had. It's unnerving. Jack, look, you've been there. Middle of the season, it's a tough time to deal with things. There's so much going on, right? During the middle of the season. So, I don't know what your thoughts are about it. Generally speaking, do you think the league is heading in that direction where it's much more like European soccer, where there's just changes like this and that, and who cares about it?
Yeah, I think that one of the coolest things about these companies, right, these businesses now in football is the massive amount of resources that have been deployed to try to get this right at each institution, both in American sports and in world sports. I think you're seeing that they're 12-month evaluations now, right? They're 12-month evaluations that everyone is making. That's how corporate America works. That's how all of really corporate sports work, is 12-month evaluations, both in the projection situations where you're projecting trend and seeing where you're headed, but also in the cyclical analysis where you're evaluating different things at different times throughout 12 months. So I don't think it should surprise us as much because everybody's doing their evaluations as they do them. Mm-hmm. And it may seem that the seasonal evaluation seems more common because there's obviously this group of people that are going under the submarine and spending this 5 months together. But quite frankly, with the amazing amount of resources that is going into sports now, it shouldn't surprise us that there's 12-month evaluations going on in every building.
And what a great point. You think about that. This didn't, of course, just happen now. I can't opine on it to a level, Eric, where I know what's going on in that building with John Robinson and Mike Vrabel. That said, it's another debate right now, right? It's like, where is the head coach and the GM on all of this, and how did it play out, right? I was very fortunate to have Mike Smith and Dan Quinn and had really, really good relationships that I was very proud of. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have your ups and downs and you banter a little bit, but it never got to a spot where it was acrimonious with either. I was very blessed with that. I get it. In this situation, there's all kinds of talk out there, Eric, as you know. What is the reason for this? And none of us have any idea. Only J-Rob and of course Mike Vrabel, and of course Amy Strunk, right? She does. So we'll see how it all plays out. I feel for John Robb and hope the best for him.
Outstanding.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, right? Because and the hard part about this is, as you guys probably know, like, head coaches are kind of the employees in the NFL. They get multiple different jobs, at the top, right? Even you guys in Houston, right? Like this is Lovie Smith's third head coaching job in the NFL, as well as one in Division 1A college football. Like, those guys get fired. They, generally speaking, can get back up top again. And, Thomas, as you know, and Jack, like, once you get to like that, executive VP role or the GM role, like, you kind of get one shot at this, right? And oftentimes, I think, Thomas, you were fortunate, although you had success, so you earned this, but like, you got to go through cycles, right? You got to go through, starting out anew, drafting a quarterback, building that thing up, bottoming out for a couple of years, getting another coach, getting back to the top of the mountain, and then, and having, some bad luck at the end, which caused you guys to move in a different direction. But there are also folks, I think about you guys, Jack, like, where you don't get the whole cycle, to your point. Like, you get to, there's sort of a start, and then you kind of trying to build towards something. And you can obviously debate whether or not the build is going right or whatever. But I think a lot of people don't necessarily get to see their whole vision painted perfectly before they get the axe. And I think with Robinson, it's like, for him, that team, it had a great rookie contract guy in AJ Brown. It had a good resurrection quarterback in Ryan Tannehill, and you had to trade one to keep the other. You get a young wide receiver in that trade who appears to be playing well, and then they cut the cord on it. I that would be frustrating for me if I was a process-driven person who didn't necessarily get to see their process go through the whole evolution of A to Z.
I'd love your thoughts on that. Big picture, we go in, we all have really strong opinions about how we want things to be, right? With the people that are in charge. I mean, it's a big deal, right? Look, we both were around Bill Belichick. I mean, what Bill did for us as far as helping us, grow and learn about what we need. We apply who we are, right? Mm-hmm. We never try to be like Bill. Those out there that try to be like Bill, I feel like they rise up to not do well, because you can't be Bill. No one can be Bill. Right. Can you talk a little bit about that, just bigger picture, mapping things out and staying the course, or do you have to be adaptable in that setting?
Yeah, I think you guys, as you evaluate, I think you make a good point about the workforce and evaluating how many times you get and different analysis there. I think it's very important, though, as you look at these jobs, specifically in the NFL, to understand that each club is in their different phase of their own evolution. Right. So it's very hard to make an analysis across the NFL, because if you look at the matriculation or the maturation of each club, Houston's the newest franchise in professional sports, right? The Tennessee Titans, they're one of the newer clubs, right? Jacksonville's a newer club, right? And so as they matriculate through systems and processes and different types of coaching trees, they get all types of different data from those decisions that they can inform future decisions with. You look at the New England Patriots, the Pittsburgh Steelers, some of these others who have grandfathered in amazing amounts of lessons where they've been able to inform their future decisions by their past decisions. And so I think it's very difficult to evaluate it by the workforce and say that, you want to see a vision through. It's really specific to each situation where that franchise is in their maturation, and understanding, does the need of the franchise match the skill set of those involved? And I think that's probably a better question than does the person get to see their vision through, because it's really not our vision. It's as much as we want it to be, it's what's right for that franchise, what's right for that organization to take the next step in their evolution.
Well, so it's a great point, Eric. Go ahead.
How do you guys, because the hard part is like, many fan bases want to see a winner, right? And beyond the fact that, like, what works in New England, like, I think of, like, there's ownership differences, right? Pittsburgh, right? They go, they move on from Colbert to Kahn, but it's kind of that same culture, and it's the same ownership, and it's the same sort of like type of player and things. So it's easier to transition. I would imagine, and we hope we don't have to see this, but I would imagine the next head coach of New England is going to have, if he's a Belichick disciple, will have better success than some of the other coaches that left New England and went to other ownership groups and other clubs where the expectations and the assumptions are different, right? We talk about assumptions all the time in our product, Thomas, where it's like you have assumptions and you can't just go in and act a certain way because your ownership is going to treat you different than Robert Kraft treats Bill. So, there's that part. But then I guess my question is we can say all these things, right? We can say like, well, this team, and I know Houston, you guys, because of the quarterback situation, it was unfortunate. You guys had to change course a little bit, and you probably were dealing with assumptions that are different than the other 31 clubs, but there's still going to be pressure from fans and pressure from media and stuff to win. How do you take the realities of the situation you're in? We talk about this with Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, with Ryan Poles and all the new GMs. How do you take the situation that you're in and change it quickly so that you can win, even though the deck is stacked and not in your favor?
Can I lead in on this for a second? Because this is fascinating to me. We were even talking about it earlier, right? Talking about adaptability, intellectual adaptability, as well as just being adaptable as a general manager and a head coach, right, Eric? Like, what I want everyone to know, fan base wise, it's easy to take shots, throw darts, have opinions, right? And that's what this business is about. 100% understand it. That said, Bill Belichick taught all of us. Anyone that's ever been around Bill Belichick is Thomas, Jack, Scott Pioli, John Robinson, Jason Light. You know your organization better than anyone. You know it better than your owner. You know it better than anyone else in the building, but for the head coach, the partnership. You set the tone. You both set the tone, the co-team builders. For the most part, there are a couple other presidents and other situations like yourself where you're very much involved, but it's a very, very small circle. But there are layers, Eric, right? There's so many layers. It's easy to step back and say, well, you should do this. What are they doing? Why didn't they do that? As team builders, 1, 2, 3, potentially 4 years out, not everything. We've talked about that. We've argued whether it stops at 2 years or 3 years. By the way, that to me is contingent on your owner. If your owner is telling you this is short-lived and you better get this damn thing taken care of in two years, well, I'm not thinking 4 years. If you have an owner that's understanding and you're understanding as a builder, it's different. So what I'm saying is there are just a lot of layers to where you finally make your decision. It may not always look positive to your fan base and media in your area, but believe me, most of us, I feel, have a direction, Eric. Most of us, not everyone. That's unfair to think otherwise. But can I just toss it over to Jack for a minute on that level?
Of course.
Again, bigger picture. When you have ideas about how things should be and they don't map out that way, can you talk a little bit about adaptability, not only with your coaches, but your team builders and generally ownership? Like, is that a big part of a topic in your mind about successful organizations?
Let me kind of break it into two different buckets because I think it's appropriate to pull some of the straws out of that overall analysis. I think, first of all, just in leadership. So if you're just talking about leading, so business, any sort of leadership initiative, I think it's very important that you don't self-impose term limits. Because if you're truly going to make great decisions on behalf of an organization or a people group, unless you're the president of the United States or you're given a term limit that's clearly expected in the relationship with the business or with the office, I think it's very important you don't self-impose term limits, because if you self-impose any term limits, you begin to massage or change the lens in which you look at the decisions you're making, potentially in a harmful way.
I.e., you're not thinking about the betterment of the organization as much as you're thinking about your own survival?
That's right. You start beginning to there's a myriad of things that begin to weigh on you and become factors on decisions that you're making, where you potentially could make a decision or two that could be either short-sighted or potentially to get a result that may have fruit produced quicker or potentially longer if there was a term deviation. So I would say there should never great leaders that don't have term limits within their seat. So again, a president or somebody who's in political office has a term limit from the get-go. But in sports, we're not given term limits from the get-go. We may research and say the average GM has 4 years or whatever. But I would say if you're really going to go in there and do it right, the healthy leader comes in and says, I'm not going to think about term limits. I'm going to think about the next right thing and vision cast 3, 5, 10 years in every way I can, from building structure to how the salary cap looks to how my staff looks, and evolve accordingly without a term weighing in on me. Because if you think about it outside in from a media shelf life, you're potentially going to make decisions that could compromise you. So that's one thing. That's just leadership. Don't self-impose term limits. But number two would be, as you go to iterate or as you go to improve the organization overall, there's really this two-layered sandwich, right? There's this transactional improvement that you want to do, create cap space, create better contract structures, create better staff structures, get great people in the building. So there's a transactional component, but then there's a transformational component, right? Where you're trying to change how people think. You're trying to change how people expect. You're trying to change how people operate. And so I think within your organization. Okay. And so I think that when you're talking about how do you do the things, to your question about how do you do things to get things better, I think great leaders are able to operate in that transactional while vision casting and also operating in that transformational. And so without a term limit and in both of those buckets, I think you have a chance to make a difference in a healthy way.
Love it. So Thomas, interesting question for you, because you had two kind of regimes when you were in Atlanta, right? Was that because I think back, like Jack, like you didn't have like that long of a time to sort of implement things in Houston, right? Like, that's great and everything, but there are years where you have a trough, and there are oftentimes, like I think of like last year in New York where, you know, Joe Judge, like everybody said, okay, this is going to be, you know, he's safe. And then things get so bad that they have to move on. Like, there's an inherent risk there, isn't there? And Thomas, like when I think about your time in Atlanta, was that something that you worked with, or if you're and it's funny, I have a few friends who listen to the show. One of them's a former NFL player that asked me, you know, you say team builder a lot. I think that the reason is you're a very inclusive guy. So you don't just think of, you know, the building of a team as you think of it as you, your scouts, the people that work with you and everything. But like you as a team builder do you have a chance to change the culture? Do you have a chance to change your opinion? Because I know one of the reasons that we're doing SumerSports is, you know, the selling point is somebody who's in your chair, you have so much to do that you don't necessarily have the time to like wake up one morning and hire somebody like Sean Clement or Paul Saban or somebody like that. Do you ever can you actually do that, or does it have to be gradual as far as changing the culture and changing the sort of direction of the team?
If I'm understanding you, yeah. So going from Mike Smith to how Mike ran things and what the culture was and what we tried to create there in the first 7 years at Atlanta to the next, 6 with Dan Quinn. Those are really important, very dichotomous approaches, I think. There's no question when we were in the hiring process, I hope I'm answering the question the right way, but I want to go there with this. When Mike got fired and we were looking for the next head coach and what we really needed in that next head coach, but I've said this before, Mike Smith, 3-time coach of the year, a really, really good football coach. It was time, much to his chagrin, of course, but we bring Dan in and we realized after really, really looking at and scrutinizing what we did in Atlanta in those first 7 years and what led us to our demise in 14, I believe. Yeah, is I tried to be as humble and vulnerable as possible. What did Mike and I do wrong during that time together, and why did it go awry? And to be able to take all of that, apply it to the search of the new head coach, and make sure that next head coach was satisfying the wants and needs that this organization needed to become that much more evolved. I'm a big believer in evolution, right? Our organization continued to take steps with Smitty, Mike Smith, and Matt Ryan as our as our quarterback. It got to a point where it got stagnant. I was right in the middle of it too. I was blessed to be around another regime, of course, but I think you can change it. I think I can adapt. I'm always learning. I have said this to you before, Eric. I would say to any owner, respectfully speaking, brother, that if the owners come in and they start working with the GM and the head coach, not as much the head coach, but the GM, get him the proper leadership, get him leadership coaching out the gate. Don't wait for 7 or 8 years where they're flailing around and they're like, my gosh, this person needs a world of help. And then you're flailing at the end of it all. Start it right now for the Quaseys of the world, or the, Andrew Berry's still fairly young in it. And this is the time that we need to work on that and to bring it back around, to be able to have an open mind and adaptable mind to say, this is where we were in the first regime. This is where we need to go to be successful. And I think if you're adaptable and you have an expansive mind, I think you can go there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there are so many people, and like, we've seen, where I used to work at PFF, and like, you've seen some places where people pigeonhole themselves as one thing. They make a directional decision and then they go with it. And there's an aspect of, this is who I am. Like, I remember growing up in Minnesota, bless his heart, he took the team to the NFC Championship game, but Brad Childress was like, I'm 55 years old. I'm not getting another head coaching job. I'm going to win my way. And it's just like, there's pluses and minuses to that. I would tend to land on your side, Thomas, where I think the world changes and you got to change with it. To that point, though, I had a couple questions. Hopefully, Thomas sent these to you, Jack, so you're not completely caught off guard. I noticed, obviously in your background, you have, extensive work in development, right? Like team development and things like that. Thomas has heard me rant about this, and I have so many opinions that I haven't been able to change the league on. But like, given the way that the league is right now, with rookie contracts being inexpensive and short, and you don't have a developmental league like some leagues do, like hockey and baseball and basketball. You also don't have as much practice time. There is an edge in developing players, and I don't know if teams are quite there yet. Can you just opine on this? Like, I feel like maybe I'm missing something, or I'm just I'm rounding up or rounding down too much. But is that? I mean, is there an edge there? And do we need to hire somebody at Sumer to help us algorithmize it so that it's easier for these teams to do? Because that's what I feel like is something that's drastically missing in the NFL.
Eric, can you do me a favor? It's just a follow-up to your question. Can you tell me specifically the area you think there's a deficit in? If you're talking about player development, you're talking about on the field, you're talking about multi-position flexibility. What are you saying specifically in the development of a player?
I think all the above. Like, you don't have so take for example positional changes, right? So in the history of the league, you've had players like Ethan Horton move from first round running back to Pro Bowl tight end. You've had corners moved. I think of Rod Woodson, right? Who's a Hall of Fame. Rod Woodson's the Ricky Henderson of the NFL. He's had a Hall of Fame career at corner, and then he had a Hall of Fame career at safety. Like, you have that part of it. You don't see that as much anymore. Like, you don't have quarterbacks. The other one, and I know Thomas has heard quarterbacks the chief one for me, because I think, as you guys, after a couple beers will agree with me, the quality of play in the league sucks this year compared to most years, right? And a lot of that is the quarterbacks are hurt, and a lot of the great quarterbacks retired. And over the course of the past decade, other than Geno Smith, and that's why Geno Smith stands out so much, we have not developed quarterbacks, right? And I think in Houston, at least, you guys were giving it a shot with Davis Mills. I'll give you guys credit there. But I think of back when Thomas was winning Super Bowls at the Pats, right? You think about the quarterbacks that were playing in the Super Bowl. Jake Delhomme was a 7th round pick, right? Rich Gannon, that was team number 4 for Rich Gannon by the time he was there. Brad Johnson, that was team number 3 for Brad. Brad was a 9th round pick. There's not even 9 rounds in the draft anymore. Tony Romo, Kurt Warner.
I'm glad there's not more, right? Yes.
Yeah, et cetera, et cetera. And nowadays, you have Kirk Cousins and Russell Wilson and Dak, but for the most part, every single quarterback in the league is either a first-round pick or a Hall of Famer. And so I don't, in years where you hit snake eyes on quarterbacks, where's the development in some of these younger guys?
Yeah, I think let me go to a different place with the question and see if this helps, and then we come back to the specific positions, or even potentially maybe some examples if you want to play them out. I think when you're assessing any business, and one of the things, I know this isn't an infomercial for Sumer here, but one of the things I loved when you guys presented to us was your goal in everything was to give things a quantity and to really show margin. show improvement margin and trajectory margin, right? Hey, here are the things that you need to be aware of, and here are some things that may be available to you from a directional standpoint. Really enjoyed that part of your presentation, because I think that's a trend, not just in football, but in all professional sports, because there's an asset management portion of this that you really have to be close to, and you have to be very in touch with, not just in free agency or in draft, but year round. I would say this, and Eric, you correct me if I'm wrong, because I think this is something we can kind of really lean into and agree on, is when you're assessing a business or you're assessing direction as a leader, you really need to assess what is fixed, right? What's fixed, right? Salary cap is a fixed thing, right? There's certain things that are fixed, right? Times you can practice in the off season is a fixed thing. And then you need to go to things that aren't fixed, right? And you need to understand all of the things you're going to put time and effort and energy and potentially strategy to that's not fixed. And your goal in the fixed asset or the fixed situation is to find out all of the things within that fixed thing and use that really well within what's fixed. Okay, we know we can only practice this many times, so we're going to use these OTAs to the max amount. We're going to get some situational football in. We're going to get some situations, have some conversations where we're doing things to work on offense, defense, special teams. And so we're going to use the fixed asset and max it out. But the non-fixed assets, so the things that are not for sure, right? Like a meeting at the end of the day about how to develop a routine, right? To make sure that young players understand a routine, morning, evening, night, and understand how to take care of their bodies. It's a non-fixed asset. It's not legislated by the NFL. Right. And so you can add that in there and you can say, hey, we want to make sure we educate our young players how to be onboarded accurately and how to develop a routine so that they can make sure they're durable and available on the field. So meeting structure is less fixed. I would say this to you, Eric, as somebody with gifts you have and the gifts that Sumer is trying to engage, those unfixed assets in the sport of football or those unfixed assessments have not even begun to be libraried. Does that make sense? You've got a library of all these things that you can evaluate, whether it's, again, time on the field, how you use it, other things, how long you do certain things, how long you meet, how long you are patient with certain things from a player participation standpoint, player flexibility, subbing, right? Offensive linemen not playing as long. I think there's things you're going to see there with subbing throughout the game like we've done defensive linemen. So, again, I would just say to you, one of the greatest things that you guys are doing, and I think should be done more, is what's fixed. How do you maximize what's fixed? And then what can be developed, to your point, and how are our strategies and our daily routines and our daily agendas matching the ability to really hone in on the unfixed things?
This is a perfect example of what we're talking about. I think when we're talking about a coaching search engine or a coaching search tool, which we'll talk about another time, of course. I mean, we can accomplish what is fixed and what we know, and leave it to the big brains like Eric, right? That's really big brains on on SumerSports Group to find out some of those advanced approaches that some people might not gather. And you bringing them to the table, our group of incredible intelligentsia, I like to call them within the SumerSports, to say, think outside, many, many layers outside, and present that to me as a former general manager, and let me get my head around it and see how we can grow with it and make it that much better. Because there are so many things that I think impede the development. And Eric and I have talked about this in the NFL. Like, there's some really smart people in the NFL, coaches and GMs. Their background, however, is not mathematics. And it may not be, of course, algorithmic, machinations. I don't even know what you would call it. So there's just I love your answer on that. I don't know if we've spun off on it.
So Eric, let me just give you an encouragement to your assessment. I think that if player development, meaning skill enhancement, right? If multi-skill development, if player participation deviation, if the ability to learn, let's say, situational analysis at a different level is all a unfixed, untapped world. I think the first point is we're not to the place yet where the flexibility and the impetus to force player development is there. I think, though, the fact that organizations are beginning to assess the unfixed assets of their organization is showing you that there will be further need for player development, and player development will come to the forefront so that things like what's happened with Debo or what's happened with Cordell Patterson, those things are not rare. Those are very normal because why? Because that is an unfixed asset. Usage of skill players is an unfixed asset. We just want to get a first down. So how do we get a first down? Well, we got to get the ball in our best players' hands in the most important situations. And to do that, I think the deviation you'll see more and more as people start seeing it's unfixed. They can play any position as long as they line up the right way in the formation and do the things that the rules require. You can do whatever, and it's unfixed.
Well, and I think, and there's a couple ideas I have about like quarterback play where like, a lot of people felt like accuracy was a fixed trait for the most part. And like you could teach a quarterback how to move better in the pocket. You could teach a quarterback to make better decisions, but the actual accuracy was fixed. And we've seen with a guy like Josh Allen where like that's not true, right? And there are parts of, and statistically speaking, with the tools that we've had and the data we've had before, that was something that we always felt was true. And then now we're sort of thinking, well, maybe, and I don't want to give away the game here, Thomas, but like maybe there's a way that we can go about measuring and making that better. But I agree. And I think obviously when you think about, it all comes back to Belichick in some ways because Belichick has in his brain what I'm trying to shove in my computer every single day. But like, you think about the playoff game against the Ravens in 2014, where they lined Shane Vereen up at tackle and they completely screw with the Ravens, and they win a game where they're down 2 scores because they decide to work around, twice, and they work around the stated rules of the game. I think that's exactly what you're saying, Jack. Whereas like there are things that are fixed, there are things that can be messed with. Make sure that that set of things that you can mess with is as big as possible, and then work within those constraints. So I like that answer. And it's just something where I look at the league and I think people are acting first order optimally, which is to say, churn and burn at quarterback because it's cheap to do so. And I think like maybe, obviously first order optimal can get you there, but it's going to take second order decisions also that are maybe first order negative, but second order positive that can help you get over the edge, especially in years like this one where it's kind of weird. That was a cool, discussion. I also think here's one other one that I had that I thought was a good question. And I think it turns to kind of some of the stuff that we talked about earlier in the show, which is, when you started out, like kind of your first year of really having, a lot of decision-making power, correct me if I'm wrong, but like when previous folks that were in Houston traded away a lot of your draft picks, like when you had to go into that 2021 draft without much in the way of resources, how do you go about that? Because that's extreme. Like you think about team building, right? And we say, okay, you build through the draft and you build your pillars, as Thomas says. If you're going into a draft like that one and you don't have a pick until the 3rd round, like what goes through your mind? Because I've always thought like, again, you didn't get graded on a curve there, but like in some ways I felt like you should have been.
Yeah, I think one thing, and you hit on it a little bit with the last discussion we had, I think one thing we're not afforded in the NFL that other sports leagues are afforded is, and specifically if we say EPL or one of these other, is the tiering out of the different franchises in relationship to where they currently are, and the understanding that if you're looking to get to level 1 or potentially you're looking to look at grade A or grade B and you're trying to move up as an organization, let's just say in European soccer, you understand the next improvement for you is to get to this place, and you kind of understand that. So I would just say, going back to your question, I think again, I think it's a 12-month evaluation, right? And so again, we evaluate. I thought that specific draft, I thought Nick did a tremendous assets, the minimal amount of assets that he had to get players that were productive. And I think at that point, you obviously have a premium on character, on the transition of the player, making sure he's going to be able to transition and make the team. You want to have a player, obviously, that can be decently functional, in year 1, because you understand that you're limited in your ability to get players with the assets you have. I thought Nick did a great job being able to get players into our building that could help us. And I don't think that you handle it that much different, other than knowing that those premium assets aren't in your cupboard, because you got to understand, as I'm sure you've articulated in previous discussions, all the players that you're drafting in round 1 or 2 are going to be available in free agent one day. They're going to be available in trades one day. You're still grading them. You're understanding them. And Nick did a great job making sure that everybody in the building locked in on those players in case they were ever available in a different capacity. And so, but from a specific transaction standpoint, if you're devoid of picks, or potentially some of the things we've seen go on in LA where there's been pick for player type transactions, and now maybe even in some of these organizations the next couple of years that have traded for the receivers with what's going on in Vegas, right? And then what's going on with Miami and Kansas City to get those premium receivers, I think you'll see people are focusing on 12-month transactions, right? At the end of the year, if there's a speedy guy, I mean, listen, I got to give credit to, Chris Greer down there in Miami, thinking about, like, at the end of Kansas City's year last year, there was obviously some level of, let's say, to Tyreek's transition, or his time there. And so that somewhere dictated itself. And he knew that was where he was going to target in free agency to transition, get a proven player versus potentially another player that was available. So I think there's a 12-month evaluation and not just the draft.
Can I add here, Eric, because these are awesome points. One of the things that I believe along these lines, when you don't have the assets like Nick was dealing with, this is Belichickian. It's always going to come around to Bill, right? Bill always knew his team so well. He was very good about disseminating the focus, the direction of what the scheme was going to be, right? We always talked about it. You can talk to Scott Pioli about it. Any of us who have ever gone through, John Robinson, Jason Light, have gone through, Bill's world. I've always thought that Bill was great at taking the 3rd and 4th rounder, Eric. Mike Vrabel's a perfect example, or Teddy Bruschi. I'm not saying that they're all 3rd rounders. I'm just saying, and say, look, this guy does these things. I mentioned this before, 3 things very well for our scheme. And if you make sure that you're educating your GM as a head coach and your personnel department when they're out looking for players, and they know we are not going to get a 1, 2, and maybe not get a pick until the 3rd round, what can we deal with? What would bolster our roster? And that's really honing in even more of what that player can offer in those 3 or 4 areas. You're not getting the Mac Daddy prospect, but let's really dig in on what you're going to be doing with your scheme and how you're going to be coaching it. And I think that's all about communication, which is a whole other topic.
Well, and I think what, there's a couple points actually. Jason from Over the Cap, who's one of it's your favorite podcaster's favorite podcaster, in my opinion. Like he brought up the question of, reduced OTAs and reduced training camp and reduced preseason. Does that hinder your ability to do those things? Because obviously the time, the practicing, getting to see them in game speed obviously matters, but less need. Like, Jack, you brought up the Rams. One of the things that Jordan Rodriguez wrote about them in The Athletic was because they've traded, they haven't had a first round. Like, other than the Washington football team way back in the 60s, like no team has gone this far without a first round pick in so long. But like they're finding, like they found like John Johnson and Jordan Fuller, and like, they found contributors after round 4. And that has to be part. And like most people would say, and I still sort of believe this, that there's a lot of noise inherent in just being able to pick players in the draft. Like it's pretty noisy, but if you can pick players that fit along with your stars in that sort of stars and scrubs approach, then it's obviously going to do a much better job than if you just pick players who maybe don't fit or whatever, and then you just have a lot of island of misfit toys. Can you guys comment on Jason's question, which is, is it harder to execute what Belichick had been executing back when you guys were on the Patriots, because there's fewer preseason games, there's fewer preseason games where guys play, and there's fewer OTAs, there's fewer training camp practices. There's not even 2-a-days anymore. Like all of us went through 2-a-days, right? Like, and that question, but in addition, this idea of like fitting pieces next to your stars. If you're going to use expensive assets to buy them, you have to use cheap assets for half a player, but it's the right half of a player.
We'll start.
Well, I'll just say this just to compliment you, Eric, on your question earlier on player flexibility and player development. I think we're talking about this conversation in the same way from the standpoint of when you have a pick is a fixed asset, right? And then when it becomes a player, it's no longer a fixed asset, right? Mm-hmm. Now it is actually an asset that can produce more than the value of the pick. And so when I look at a situation, just coming to mind here on players I know well, Garrett Wallow, okay. Nick picks Garrett Wallow in the shortened draft that you mentioned with limited assets. Well, okay, if he can play special teams, if he has multiple roles, if he's high character, if he's going to be available to the team, he's now taken a fixed asset, right, and made it into an unfixed asset because we don't know where it's going to go. Is it going to be 3 years? Is it going to be 7 years? Is it going to be a Hall of Famer? You never know. But I think what you're trying to describe, Eric, which is obviously you're gifted academically to understand this, is that you're really in the threshold of a fixed asset becoming a potential multiplication asset or an asset that can be multiplied and obviously set off dominoes all throughout, your ledger sheet. And so I think you feel a little bit of a pressure that it should look a certain way. It should look like picks. It should look like free agency. It should look like, in the Rams case, hitting on players better. But I don't think you should ever pigeonhole yourself into that one myopic view because, again, where each franchise is so different. And the understanding of the ability to take whatever fixed asset I have, cap space or potentially a player, a pick, and try to cash it in for a player, cash it in for a group of players, you then want that fixed asset to become an unbelievably unfixed asset that is massive. I mean, when they signed Cordell Patterson, probably, I wouldn't imagine they might have thought kick returner, might have thought some things, but I wouldn't think they imagined they'd be running stretch runs to him and then he'd be house calling kickoffs at the same time, right? And so I think you just got to really stay locked in on the idea that what the fixed assets are, and then you're going to transition them into other things and they can multiply really quickly. And that's the goal of anything.
The big pick, with the Rams, and again, like I don't necessarily agree with everything the Rams have done, but when they traded for Jalen Ramsey, you think about defensive backs, it's all about not having weak legs, right? And so, if you think about you have a guy who can just play left corner in an elite way, your other 4 defensive backs, like if one of them goes bust, then you're still going to have weaknesses in the secondary. With Ramsey, I'm assuming they knew from his film at Florida State and also with the Jaguars that he could man up on a tight end, right? Or he could play in the slot, or he could defend the run really well. So what you do then, and I'm a Kansas City fan, so I think about back when we won the Super Bowl, Tyrann Mathieu, Juan Thornhill tears his ACL in week 17, and then he comes in and plays nickel, and Kendall Fuller plays free safety. Now all of a sudden, like you turn the math on the problem, right? Because you have assets, as to your point, can play multiple positions, and all of a sudden you're not fixed at this one position being a weakness because one of your star players can go and be average in a position so that somebody else doesn't have to be below average at theirs. And I think that is a something that we are trying to fit into roster value at Sumer, Thomas, right? Like that's a big thing. And I think it causes this nonlinearity in the problem that makes it rich. But I also think, football people, I think inherently know that in their bones, and we're trying to, mathematize it, I think.
Great points. Keep rolling, bro.
Okay. So we got a couple cool questions. Like, and actually, I actually want to ask you guys, because it's not about team building, but I do want to ask you guys this question. Okay. Tim Keller, one of our, we have a lot of loyal listeners, by the way. I have not shouted him out yet. And by the way, folks that are listening on Twitter, on YouTube, we really appreciate you. And obviously, we appreciate Jack for joining us today. Tim Keller, one of our loyal listeners, asked, what are the takeaways from a tie? Eric once mentioned the idea of counting one possession wins and losses as half wins. It's kind of silly, but like, do you guys feel like we should ties exist? And if they exist, should they really just be should we do away with overtime if we're going to have ties to begin with? Like, I feel like this is like part of this whole, like, and you guys are both progressive. You guys like soccer. Like, I feel like you're going to give a better answer to this than most. Like, what do you guys think about ties?
I don't know if I'm going to give a great answer on this. I'm going to say I'm categorically against ties. It's just at the fabric of how I was raised. It's tough for me to walk away. It almost feels like how I was raised. My dad was a long time hard ass football man. And I was
well,
like,
that's why the Rouge exists in Canada, which, like, look, there's a lot of things Canada does better than the States, including Tim Hortons coffee. But that's one. The Rouge lowers the chances of a tie substantially, Thomas. And I do feel like that could ameliorate some of the problems that we have with ties in the NFL. But I digress.
No, that's good. That's good. Look, all I'm saying is it's really tough for me. The idea of like fighting to the very end, and if someone slips up eventually, either through exertion or just being completely enervated and they can no longer pick their hand up to make the tackle and someone wins, then so be it. I get it. There's so many other levels to that, but it's tough. I'm not going to give you a really educated answer on that. It's more at the core, sort of soulful human element answer to me. You might opine in a different way.
Yeah, I'd say I'm definitely adamantly against ties. I think you want to leave every contest with a winner and loser. I think when you tie, I think what comes away with it is an overvaluation of situational football. Really, a lot of times that puts some sort of impetus on were you aggressive, were you not, were there things you could have done to avoid the tie. I do think that as not having ties has come up in the league and in other sports, there is a difficulty of talking too much about rinky-dink types of ways to fix the tie. So if you're saying to me, Eric, that ties are going to go away and we've got a great competitive solution that's not a skills Pro Bowl competition at the end and it's true football, it's a way to finish strong, I'll do it. If you're saying to me we're throwing quarterbacks or throwing balls through hoops to decide, I'll pick the tie.
That's a great answer.
This might be the fact that in my senior year of college we lost 7 games and 5 of them were by a combined 9 points. I would have rather those games be ties, but I will say, like, my issue with, and I think you brought it up, Jack, my issue with relative to how we've done overtime now, I prefer ties because I think I don't know if overtime is too dependent on the coin flip. And I think that offenses are so good and kickers are so good that I think that overtime back in the 80s and 90s when quarterbacks weren't as good and defenses were better and kickers weren't as good, I felt like overtime picked the winner better back then. I think now it's like the 10-minute, and again, Michael Lopez, who's a friend of mine who runs the NFL data and analytics, like I think he is very diligent in trying to find a solution there that prevents injuries and all that kind of stuff. So they're diligently looking for the solution here. And Michael actually wrote an article about hockey where he showed that when as the season progresses, hockey teams jump and chase more often just to pick up the 1 point because they rather just go to overtime, pick up the 1 point, go up at 1 point in the standings, and then coin flip for overtime for that second point. So I agree that like making ties more prevalent would cause some bad behavior. So it's an interesting question, but I do think like last week's game, Washington and New York tying actually was beneficial for both teams. And I think that like that causes but you don't want these players playing for 70-minute, 75, 80-minute games either. So I think it's really hard there.
Let me just say before we go, because it's 10 more seconds, Jack, you don't know the background of Eric and where he has been on the gambling side. He is a very smart gambling guy. So I'm sure somewhere in there, these teams both tying, it worked in his favor. And there's an element there if you were to be honest. But he's now with SumerSports, so he can't gamble like he used to, of course. So
so there is part of that as well. I think here's a good question. And I know we only have a few minutes left, but here's from Frazier. Frazier's a very loyal listener to the show. If you're on YouTube or Twitter, you can actually read this on the video. Frazier says, do you think that loan deals like soccer, football/soccer could work? Have deals where other teams in the NFL, perhaps other leagues like the CFL or AAF, loan a player to a team for a designated amount of time? You guys could probably opine on this a little bit more. I just think the difference between the NFL and all the other leagues is so drastic that it's going to be hard for this to really work. I mean, you've seen Warren Moon come up from the CFL, Doug Flutie and Jeff Garcia and stuff, but really it's not as prevalent anymore because the NFL is king and all the problems that the league had in the 80s with labor and stuff have pretty much gone away. So is there any chance for that to happen as far as helping development and helping teams sort of, Jack, you talk about teams in different cycles of their career. Would there be something where, a team like, let's say let's say the Los Angeles Rams loan a Matthew Stafford to a team like the Niners when they're out of the division race and the Niners aren't, and the Niners want to go win a Super Bowl. It's probably sacrilegious given how that they're rivals, but like that would be something of an equivalent in the NFL, which just seems sacrilegious to me.
Yeah, within the division or within the NFL, I think you'd have some challenges there. I think the question kind of hits at lower level football, right? The fact that there may be some, I would say there could be a purchase price and or a compensation mechanism to lower level football as these other leagues continue to take root. And quite frankly, as the college players continue to build a net worth that's going to be big. I think there'll be a financial transaction between a player that's making $8 to $10 million at the University of Alabama one day, or even a player who's playing really well in the CFL. I think there could be a financial way to measure that transaction, but at the transfer back and forth would be dangerous because of the injury frequency, right? Mm-hmm. I think if you have a guy that you you're bringing in, you have a transaction, you want to bring him in with the intention for him to be a part of your team until you decide otherwise. I don't think the loaner piece, I think that'd be difficult.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, both of you all. And I would just say, when I was building teams over the years and in that general manager spot, and I would go to Mike Smith or Dan Quinn and say, like, where are we? Where are we short? There were times towards the end of the year where you're scratching and clawing for anything you can get that would be even adequate. A 5, right, on our grading scale of 1 to 9. It was a 5, Eric. We talked about it. That, or maybe even a 4 at times. That is important to know that there is somewhere you can go. It's an interesting thought, meaning there are some CFL players that could come in and have a spot in the NFL. So I would like the idea of it, but it's rare in my mind.
Yeah, there are people, and actually I really like this comment here by Eli, who says that, that's how player development will work in the future, a loan from college. I'm a little bit like, there are reasons why 19-year-olds don't play in the NFL. Like, there's a physical aspect that I think is difficult, especially, and this is maybe you guys, I think it's where you need it the most is actually where you can pick it off the least. The closer to the ball you are, like, the harder it is to develop from college to pro, and the more scarce, like, offensive linemen, that's the most scarce position in the league, right? And so this idea that, like, and you look at the lower leagues like the AAF and the XFL, actually Sam Schwartzstein of the XFL did a really good job of actually lineman development, but like linemen, that's to me where I see it. Like, could you getting these guys reps, and to your point that you talked about earlier in the podcast, Jack, like, the 5 guys play the whole game, right? So if you're lineman 6 or 7 on a team, you can go a whole year and play like 10 snaps. And like, what good is that really doing you to a certain extent?
Before Jack takes that, let me just quickly. Yeah, I have always been. I mean, there's no way that a college kid could come in, or it's just different. Now, Jack, he's got hoop in his background, right? Yeah, so does Eric. Eric's he showed me a picture of him slamming, dunking a ball. I don't know, how heavy were you? 45? I can't remember. I
was 250 when I dunked that ball. Yeah,
he was 250. This was over 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So you guys, I love basketball too. I didn't play. You guys are much taller than I am, but from a basketball standpoint, I've always felt, yeah, that cat can come in and do what he can do. But in football, man, that is a bear maturing, not having matured totally like some of these NFL guys. It would be another really, really rare occurrence in my mind.
Yeah, I think there's the two-way contracts work really well because there's a specific skill and a time on task that they're trying to develop with very little risk of injury. And so when you're talking about a higher risk of injury and potentially you're talking about that age differential and the body development, I think those would thwart that potential. But I'll say this, a successful Canadian player, a successful XFL or other player that's really successful, hey, the Atlanta Falcons want to go get that guy. Hey, we'll give you $500,000 to your organization as a price for this player to transfer to our organization. I could see some level of transition for that, just compensation wise.
I love it. And it was funny. I was talking to a head coach in the CFL who was a good friend of mine, Mike O'Shea, went to the University of Guelph as well. Mike O'Shea is a fantastic football coach, but we were talking about what's going on in the CFL right now, right? Little aside, because you're a CFL aficionado, Eric. It's tough for that group, right? I feel like the commissioner, as I know, and some of the owners are looking to do away with what used to be a big part there, right? The import, non-import rule. They wanted Canadian content in the CFL. And now they're moving towards like, let's just get whoever we can get the best players. It's tough for the traditional, sort of the people that grew up with Canadian football. It's tough for them to get their heads around that. And Michael Shea being a Canadian head coach there and doing really, really well, it's tough for him to look at that and see the changes that might be going. It's a little aside, but what I am saying is I love the idea of being down here in the NFL to be able to pull that special CFL player. Right. Some of those people there have been fighting it. The contracts the way they are, it's tough for them to think about letting their stars leave and then never coming back.
But we did see a positive, right? Like, so the AAF failed because of finances, the XFL failed because of COVID. The USFL this past spring, what we saw was they started right around Easter weekend and then they finished right around July 4th. Now, not that many USFL players made clubs. Cavante Turpin's the kick returner, gadget guy for the Cowboys. Maurice Alexander's the return man for the Lions. And like there are a few guys, Greg Odom would have made the Browns had he not tore his ACL, so on and so forth. But one thing that was really cool was them ending in July meant that all those guys were in shape to the point where you had 65 to 100 guys in camp because they were healthy and fit enough to compete. And so like even from the perspective of having bodies in there so you can run an efficient camp, like that was a useful part of that league. I think it was probably, aside from getting through the league, with all the games for the first time since 2001's XFL, like that was like the best part of that league was that it gave, the folks in the league a bunch of people who could at least help them from that perspective. So, good questions there. Yeah, I think that this is, it's so cool. Like, I think there's so much that the NFL does right. And then there's a lot of stuff where, we're kind of chipping around at, well, do we want to change this about the league? Like, should we have a different rookie wage scale versus, should we work within that rookie wage scale to make a different, confluence there? So we've gotten a fairly decent amount of questions here. I think that's probably it for us. The last one that I'll go with, and this is Zach Rogers. Zach is a very loyal listener to the show. How much value is gained by the 49ers and Patriots sort of having the head coach? How many value is gained or lost? You guys can give me your opinion on having the head coach kind of have similar like decision-making 53/GM powers. I know we're going to get different answers from you guys than we might get from some others, but essentially there was a question here about, can a guy grocery shop and cook for an NFL team, essentially?
Do you want to take it first? Or you want me to? I mean, look, I'm a general manager, right? And I think there's a division of tasks that I think if you have the right relationship between the general manager and the head coach, an unbelievable amount of respect for the lines that exist and the responsibilities and the intelligence and the insight and the foresight on both sides, you can create this unbelievable relationship that can take you in the right direction, regardless of who has 53. Let me say this. Every general manager wants 53. And head coaches right now, I think we probably have 2/3 of the league right now. General managers have 53. But, oh, by the way, a little aside, look what just happened in Tennessee. John Robinson, I've said this before, he had full say. And now he's no longer there. So it's a really interesting argument. I will say most general managers want it to take the pressures off those head coaches that when they first come into being head coaches, there is like all their lives they've dreamed about being the Bill Parcells or the Bill Belichick or Lombardi or some whatever, who so many of the historic coaches, and they get an opportunity, but they quickly realize, Eric, and we talked about it today, they quickly realize like I have so much on my plate. And in the end, by Dan Quinn's own admission, the last 2 years, Thomas, I just want to coach this team. I don't want to worry about departments. I don't want to worry about the sock color. Yes, of course, I could take that off of him as a GM, in charge of all the departments. I heard the same thing about, Minnesota's coach,
Zimmer.
Zim said to Rick Spielman, he's like, look, just let me coach. And I think the more these real true at the core coaches realize, they're like, let me be the best coach I can be. Let you do all the other stuff as a general manager. be the acquiring guy, acquire free agents, acquire the draft side of it all. You bring it in. You're in charge of that. And in the very end, very end, Eric, and I can go on and on about this, someone has to have 53. And I think if there's so much passion and the foresight for the head coach is inherently going to be limited more than the GM. So if you're sitting there and you're at loggerheads about that last player or that linebacker, and you guys both disagree on that linebacker, someone has to make that choice. And if it's a coach sometime and he's thinking short term, he may only say, I want this guy. I don't care if he's got issues. I don't care if he's got off-field issues. I don't care anything, but for here and now, we're going to win this next 4 games. I want him. And the GM is saying, wait a minute. I want the long term on this. I want a contract that I know is manageable or not. There are so many layers that a GM is thinking about. So in the end, look, I'm a big believer in it. And I think a lot of head coaches, as long as you give them a massive seat at the table, which you will, right? GM and head coach, if you have the right relationship, it really doesn't matter in the end who has it. I'm not speaking out of both sides of my mouth, Eric, but take it off the head coach and let him coach the team to the best of the ability. And I think they can win Super Bowls.
Before Jack interjects an answer, I want to extend this question a little bit too, because Obama Robot Voice, another listener that we've had a few times, said, how much do teams invest in decision-making for coaches? And this is something we talked about. I think what you said, Thomas, can extend on the field as well. And here's what I mean. Everybody wants to be Andy Reid, right? Who's a head coach that's in charge of everything, calls the plays, but also head coaches. And I think many a head coach has failed on the field because they try to demonstrate their play calling chops while also learning how to manage a game. To your point, Thomas, I also think that the head coach, many have failed by trying to demonstrate their evaluation and player picking prowess while also trying to be a head coach. Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a very, very, very good point you just made there, Eric, because academically what you've done is historically evaluated a job description desire flop. We talked briefly earlier in the show about, fixed and unfixed. And just to stick with that theme for a second, I would say this, and I'm more modern in my approach of this, and Thomas knows this, is, job descriptions are not a fixed asset. Mm-hmm. Right. And so when you're looking to assess an organization, doesn't matter what it is, if you're informed by corporate America and the world, you see that job descriptions evolve. Right. So we didn't have people who handled chief information officers. Right. Mm-hmm. Chief information officers now, a data security and all the things that are out there. His is a corner office, serious job that is probably informing CEOs and other people in a more informative way than almost anybody in the building in relationship to risk, in relationship to strategy, in relationship to information, right? Yeah. And so we didn't have that position 10 years ago in almost every company in America. If so, it was someone helping maybe install computers and some of the tech-based limited thinking. I would say all job description, okay, not just GM and head coach, is an unfixed asset, meaning that each organization has to evaluate where they've been good, where they've been bad, who they want to entrust assets with, who they want to entrust fixed assets with, who they want to entrust things with, and then allow those things that have informed the past to indicate who should have certain things and understand.
This is fascinating. This is a major revelation on SumerSports show with Eric Eager and Thomas Dimitroff and Jack Easterby. Let me just say something. I'm sitting there thinking about, and I am passionate, as you can tell, about it because of what I went through, with both Smitty and Dan Quinn, right? In the ends of what happened. And yet, as you present this, I started thinking, we're talking about having this flexibility. What if we sat down, and correct me if I'm wrong here, because I started thinking we're smart enough as, again, GM and head coach to say, let's sit down after a season. Let's look at what happened. Can we possibly map out what you have, head coach, on the decision side of the personnel, the 53 side, and what you have, GM? Could you really map out 10 to 15 elements that you're saying, this is yours, this is mine, this is yours, this is mine, all the way down?
Even down to job descriptions for the players, right? Like we talked about this, Thomas, when we were working together back when I was at PFF. It's like, whether it's through an algorithm or through like a scout or some combination of it, like, you signed Dante Robinson to be a every down corner, and 2 years in, it's like he can only play nickel. Well, that's got to be an understood assumption for every single person in the building, right? And I bring it back to Childress. Brad went to Minnesota. He never called plays for Andy Reid. So he went to Minnesota and tried to prove to everybody he could call plays. And it didn't work out that well. And then in year 2, he's like, Darrell Bevell, you're calling plays. Well, everybody's got to know, well, okay, if Darrell's going to call plays, then we need something different out of our fullback. We need something different out of our tight end. And the job descriptions change when the assumptions change. And I think the big thing, and then maybe this is something, for us to do at Sumer, I think the big thing is if everybody in the room can commit to those assumptions, they don't have to agree with everybody, but they can commit to the assumptions, then I think things are much less, all those lines are less blurry. Hey, I'm picking the 53, but I respect your decision-making prowess when you need a player. If we get into the final 4 weeks of the year and we need a win to make a wild card, I respect I will do what's necessary, right? If that means you pick this, rotational defensive end, then it means you pick this rotational defensive end.
I interrupted, Jack, so finish your comments. And I know we have to finish off here soon, right, Jack? Eric?
Well, I just think, again, if we're saying it's a 12-month analysis, which we've said with the decisions that were made this week, we're saying that assets are used all year round in all of the building. We're saying that there are asset multipliers, right? There are things that can make a great coach is an asset multiplier, right? He can take things and he can make things play above value. He can make them play in ways that maybe they weren't even designed to play. And potentially he can use less and maybe get more, right? So a coach is a great asset multiplier. And that's a part of his job description, to take the things that he's given and make them work, or potentially make them efficient and effective. So I would just say, in corporate America, we're very comfortable with, if it's a 12-month analysis, take the job descriptions, evaluate them according to production, and give people who produce more and give people who don't produce less, and potentially replace people who aren't producing at all. And so I would say, Eric, if I'm in the total holistic development, I would not start with the question, who has the 53? You may get there because the 53 is a fixed asset. It's the roster. It's a number that you have to get to. Therefore, it has to be assigned to a person and probably put in a line item of a job description. But I surely wouldn't start with that. If I'm going to make a great organization and we're going to build it brick by brick, I'm going to start with every job description we have in the organization on a wall, and how that fits the curriculum that's going to lead us to great decisions.
Okay, so I know we're about ready. Let me tell you this. This is a great point. All right, so as evaluators, GMs, we have been working for 14 months to free agency and the draft. This is not a beat against the head coaches. This is more the reality of it. Head coaches and their staff don't have an opportunity to spend anywhere near that time, sometimes only 2 weeks looking at their position when they're getting ready for free agency. When a linebacker coach is getting ready for the draft, it's limited versus what's been out there on the personnel department. That's why a lot of us argue that as GMs. Now, let me just say, in the end, if I look at it right now, Eric and Jack, put your egos in check and let's really decide what is best for the organization. And back to what this massive revelation, maybe it is 5 things that the head coach really has regarding the personnel side that I've been holding on to for dear life.
Right.
But maybe there are 5 elements of those decisions that my ego is saying what's best is for the head coach to take care of these 5 things, and let me take care of these 10 per acquisition. And that's something that maybe I go in with a different mindset next time.
Well, and I would just say this, you're a multifactorial thinker, right? So anytime, and you're the same way, Eric, just listening to you articulate what you think about, you're a multifactorial thinker. And so I think what happens is when you partner, right, or you create a business, you want to make sure that multifactorial thinkers are thinking with multifactorial thinkers. And so if you've got different levels, I think there's a deviation there. Sometimes can lead to more control. That will then perceive in your own mind, or lead you to perceive that decisions will be better if the multifactorial thinker takes it. I would just say in that case, that's not true team. True team is, hey, listen, we have a group of people who've all been given a job description that contributes to team success, that they can reproduce under pressure. And in all of those things, while they're all going on, we're not going to ask anybody to do something that potentially could put our asset management at risk with the greater team in mind, right? And so I would just say, man, I think a lot of this will get reconfigured over time. I think education of the asset manager, positions, as we've seen, people use the buzzword analytics. It's not analytics. You know that, Eric.
Yeah.
But people will begin to have informed decisions, and those informed decision makers will also have a seat at the table, and the table will lengthen. And as the table lengthens, better decisions will be made, I believe. And then also those job descriptions we just talked about will be reconfigured and evaluated.
Well, Eric and his data brethren, they want to be at the table, which is good segue out.
You got a seat.
They want to be at the seat.
Well, yeah, this has been great, Jack. We really appreciate you for all those that came late. This was Jack Easterby, our first guest, the former executive vice president of football operations for the Houston Texans, also had stints with the New England Patriots and Jacksonville Jaguars and my Kansas City Chiefs. This has been the 10th episode of the SumerSports Show. I want to circle back on a few things. A, we really appreciate you all for listening. B, Thomas and I are going to transition into 2 shows a week, starting hopefully next week. If you have basically suggestions for which days, obviously Thomas and I probably won't be able to do it Sunday morning before the NFL games or something like that, but please at Eric Eager _ on Twitter. If you want to, provide days, Thomas and I will be pretty accountable and accommodating to our listeners, but we really appreciate you all for coming. Jack, again, we really appreciate you for traveling to see Thomas and entertaining all of his wild and crazy thoughts about the game, and hopefully, by extension, mine as well during the show. So we really appreciate you for coming. So for Jack Easterby, for Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager, and this has been episode 10 of the SumerSports Show.